University. He's interested in embodied cognition, prediction, and prospection. And he will speak about, I lost the, the program today. Jeremy, if you can start sharing your screen. Active dynamical prospection.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Screen sharing working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carlos, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Jeremy. I'm at UC Berkeley, where I'm a PhD candidate, and I'm just going to jump in because I have too many slides. This is work done with my advisor, John Chuang. Yeah, so our paper is titled Active Dynamical Prospection. We're modeling mental simulation as something like particle filtering for sensorimotor control during pathfinding. And so to unpack that a little bit, I want to start with swarm cognition, which is this idea from Triani and Tuji, in which they suggest that the combination of concepts from artificial life and cognitive science might fruitfully guide the modeling of cognitive mechanisms. And this, I think, is a very nice framing of a very well-established belief in modern AI and A-life that relatively simple unit dynamics, whether implemented in neurons or organisms, can, in concert with many others obeying similar rules, produce these complex behaviors that we're interested in. And in the domain of spatial navigation, which is an interest of ours, there's an idea that mental simulation, which is sometimes called internally generated sequences or pre-play, allows us to preview candidate paths and experience their downstream consequences prior to committing to them. And I think that there's an intriguing open question here, however, which asks whether such simulative processes are necessarily serial or whether they can be performed at some level in parallel. And so in this work, we attempt to apply this idea of swarm cognition to the domain of pathfinding and explore a potential speculative answer, which is that perhaps simulation processes can be modeled by an ensemble of particles with simple unit dynamics that are guided by serial, flexible, and abstract processes such as gaze control and the wider motor system. And so that brings us to the kind of main goal of this work, which is to use a partially observable pathfinding task to explore the coordination of visual search and spatial navigation. And so I'll introduce our task considerations and kind of how we ended up where we ended up. So in terms of task design, we sought to design a pathfinding paradigm that would allow us to study navigation in a slightly more richly embodied and therefore perhaps naturalistic setting than like a traditional grid world. And also enable us to collect both navigation dynamics and exploration via visual attention. And so that left us with a browser-based pathfinding task that looks a little bit like this. So participants sit at this egocentric screen center. They're surrounded by this blue reach zone. And the landscape is initially totally hidden, a black screen, except for the goal locations, which are visible. And so because of this, the participant has to actively explore the landscape by moving their cursor around the screen, which operates in a spotlight-like manner, to reveal the holds that are available underneath their cursor. And then in order to actually navigate this landscape, participants have to reach for a hold, something close enough to their current location within the reach zone, drag it towards themselves. And when they do this, the entire landscape kind of shifts uniformly towards them, and they can navigate towards a goal this way. And I think this sounds very complex, but it's actually intuitive enough for participants to become comfortable with and perform well at after a couple of practice rounds. And this is just an example of one of our maps. This is a challenging map. Only the leftmost goal location is actually connected, and the other two are not obtainable. Okay, so just to talk through this model and where it came from. So I wanted to provide some intuitive foundation, which comes from Gibson, who extended work on affordances to these dynamic contexts like driving. So he has this great figure at right, where a driver perceives this field of safe travel, as he calls it, in front of their vehicle. And notably, this field carries a lot of information, more than a single hypothetical trajectory. And so it's maybe better characterized as like an energy landscape or internal generative model of the future occupancy. And it's capable of producing multiple plausible trajectories and anticipating their consequences. And so this concept of generative pre-play and kind of prospective coding enables the preview of multiple possible paths in the future. And these ideas have been well explored in computer science. We have Monte Carlo techniques in reinforcement learning, and slightly more recent work on successive representation as a way of representing the current in light of the future occupancy of an agent. And in our implementation of this model, we attempt to link the putatively parallel process of low-level prospective coding and the necessarily serial process of gaze control to see if the results can produce effective spatial exploration in an agent. So I'm just going to run through a conceptual explanation of this model, key dynamics, and leave the math and details and code to the paper and our repository. The task for the model was consistent with a web-based experiment. So it allowed an artificial fovea to be moved around the landscape to uncover the topology. So the model starts with a naive distance to goal prior, which is seen as an energy gradient towards the goal at the right that kind of becomes cool at the lower right corner. And hold locations are assigned low energy or a high probability of occupancy once they're discovered by visual search, once the fovea passes over them. And particle ruleouts simulate candidate paths. And these particle dynamics recapitulate the agent's own transition constraints. So for example, how far they can reach and prefer transitions to lower energy regions, so performing like an attractor that way. And then on each time step, we perform a simulate, evaluate, and then act or attend loop. So trajectory origins are sampled from the landscape with a strong bias towards the current fovea position. And simulations or trajectories that are passing into high energy areas produce surprise or prediction error, which attracts visual attention on the next time step. And the energy landscape is updated under each particle jump based on the trajectory's terminal energy. And so there's an example of this here. We have a particle example in our schematic that ends up on the goal, and we can see that the energy has reduced under each of the locations that it passed through. And so this is the primary learning dynamic. And then finally, when a time steps rollout batch reaches some consensus, so all particles move in the same approximate direction as defined by the variance of the initial direction, then the agent actually attempts to navigate to a hold in that direction. And we tuned this algorithm univariately against each hyperparameter. We try to keep the hyperparameters as few as possible using a naive success rate outcome. And that we felt gave us a strong enough single configuration against which we can compare human results without overfitting or actually even seeing human data first. So just to see what these human results look like, this is aggregated attention maps. So the cursor positions across 2 different maps and all 81 participants who completed the experiment. Visualized in pink are the cursor coordinates, which we refer to as attention, which fell within the reach zone. And so they're an indication of more proximal exploration or navigation. And the blue coordinates are those cursor coordinates that fell outside of the reach zone and therefore might be interpreted as an indication of simulation or kind of downstream exploratory behavior. The egocentric design of the task allows for some very straightforward visualizations of individual differences in behavior. And so for example, by visualizing attention coordinates as a time series, as we've done here, we can see the shape of trajectories that are explored. So some participants exhibit these radial simulations, this kind of out and back search, while others seem to scan the map in a cyclic manner. We also see significant variation in overall explore-exploit strategies. So for example, the participant in the upper right figure there clearly uses more of a greedy policy of navigation to nearby holds without any exploration outside of the reach zone downstream. All right, so these are another way of visualizing human behavior. So these are a couple of videos. And just as a reminder, the actual hold locations were not visible to participants. They're just shown here for reference. Let me see if I can play these. So what we're going to see here is human participants moving in both directions. We have some stragglers that are in blue. That's the actual agent location, whereas the larger circles are the position of the fovea as the environment is being explored and as participants are navigating. This is map 9, which we can see there's a fork. But eventually most participants end up at the rightmost goal location. And just to very briefly summarize some of our kind of quantitative behavioral analyses, on the top we have the result that the delay prior to the first navigational move, which we see as a proxy for initial visual exploration before navigation starts, was not itself overall correlated with trial success, but among successful trials, when we filtered the successful trials, more exploration resulted in greater performance or better path efficiency. And on bottom, we have regressions of, again, trial-wise score versus the mean attention distance, so how far away from the egocentric center people were scanning. And again, this is a measure of exploratory behavior. And we see an increasingly strong positive correlation against map difficulty. And so I interpret this as a highlighting that the value of exploration is maybe unsurprisingly highly dependent on task difficulty, and even greedy policies were effective on some of our simpler maps. So now we're just going to take a quick look at how agents performed on this task. So what we're going to see in these videos, if both of them load, is the same 2 maps and sample agent runs. And so we're going to see a yellow ring, which is the fovea that moves across the landscape. And we're going to see cooler colors that represent lower energy attractors, And we're going to see the landscape and more quickly get exhausted when they're moving through higher energy regions. And then we have a dashed black line that shows the agent's actual navigation through the environment. So let me see if I can play these. So again, these are the same two maps that we saw the human results for. This is kind of uniformly exploring initially, then we're finding a path to the right, and eventually navigating finally to the goal. And then this is map 9. So we have, this is one that had a sort of a fork in the road. There's the high road and the low road. Explore initially the upper path, find that maybe it's not well enough connected, and eventually go down to the lower path that is easily and unambiguously connected. So we ran 30 episodes for each of these maps using the same score optimized parameter settings, so just kind of one configuration for the agent. And we compared results with human data in a couple of different ways. And what we find overall are similarities and differences, which is what we expected. In our heat maps, we see kind of similar characteristics around, for example, the focus of attention on gaps that are close to the reach radius, because both agents and humans struggle to evaluate whether or not, in fact, two holes could be reached from one another. One example of the difference is on the left, the kind of central figure there shows the agents and humans on this particular map chose really different goals to pursue. So the agents preferred the southmost goal, which was a little bit closer, whereas humans almost exclusively went for the southwestmost goal. And that seems to be influenced by the fact that the south goal was much more ambiguous, and that was a problem that agents didn't really struggle with, but humans were unsure whether they'd be able to reach the goal that way. And then if you just look at all of our maps together, we have these two scatter plots. On the left, we have success rates, and on the right, we have the duration of trials. And we can see a decent correlation between the two. So then qualitatively, there's also quite a bit to mine in these data. In addition to what we already mentioned, we see a parallel attentional bias around path forks. So these are decision points that prompt maybe downstream simulations or evaluation of to disambiguate between the routes. And we found that agents were at these decision points much more likely to get kind of stuck evaluating equivalue trajectories. So if they look like they're approximately as good as each other, that was a problem for agents and not a problem that humans experienced. We also see a behavior that we might call optimistic exploration, where particle rollouts confronted with unexplored territory produce these radiating paths you can see in the top figure with a slight bias towards goal locations. And so these high energy terminals produce prediction error maps, and that attracts the phobia and facilitate the discovery of not yet seen, but navigationally useful hold locations. So this is an example of sort of an adaptive optimism that appears in both humans and agents. And then as Lana Sinapayan reminds us, failures in complex systems can be extremely informative. And while we didn't set out to imitate failures in this work, we found a number of emergent dynamics that appear to be consistent with human failures in this task. And so I'll just mention two very quickly. So one is really just search depth and backtracking, where we find that both humans and agents sometimes deeply explored what you might call a garden path trajectory to a goal. But because it was impossible to precisely measure reachability of every hold along that path, disconnected paths that were actually not connected, sometimes led to backtracking, which you can see in the bottom. And then we also found something that we call spatial drift in the model, where we found that the location of low energy holds within the spatial model would drift over time as new particle rollouts pass through those locations. But due to the kind of stochasticity of the rollout dynamics, it would push the energy well outwards and away from the true hold location. And the dynamic can be corrected when the phobia passes again over the same hold, but the drift could proceed for quite a while and move quite far from the actual hold location. An example of that can be seen in the hold just to the north of the agent in the bottom figure. There's sort of like this purple shadow around the hold. And so that was an interesting finding that may or may not be consistent with human data. So just to quickly conclude, I'll defer other results to the paper, but we see this as a proof of principle that a single mechanism, which we are talking about as parallelized particle rollouts through this learned energy landscape. So this single mechanism can be used to drive both visual attention and navigation and produce behavior with some quantitative and qualitative similarities to human performance. And we note several limitations of this model, including the inability to explore paths bidirectionally, which is something we see frequently in humans, as well as some confounds in our design, making it a little bit difficult to tease apart navigational behavior from visual search. But these are things that we plan to address in our future work with this model. So thank you very much for listening, and thanks to my co-author, and our code and all of the videos from all the runs are available on my website.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Are there any questions? You can raise your hand or type them in the Q&A. In the meantime, I want to play the good old-fashioned AI devil's advocate. And I mean, just the argument that, so for example, airplanes fly, but not necessarily using the same mechanisms that flying animals use. So, I mean, your research is interesting for understanding human perception, but then if we want to build artificial perception, we might be inspired by human perception, but maybe, I mean, being arrogant enough, we could even think that we can build even better one. I don't know whether you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I guess I would push, I completely agree. I would push back against that arrogance a little bit, because I do worry that we are perhaps overestimating our own abilities and underestimating the time that evolution has had. But really the answer is that my primary interest is in humans and cognition in general. I'm not as interested in kind of developing performant systems that can get better at pathfinding than humans are. I'm much more interested in understanding how we do it, because I think there's a lot of complexity and kind of intellectual curiosity to be had just from that quest alone. I do think that it's relevant for us to understand, especially those of us who are building artificial systems. I think it's very relevant to understand how humans perform these tasks. And so when we talk about augmenting human planners or navigators, I think it's really important for artificial systems to be aware of what strategies we're using, what it means, how humans are using gaze in these kinds of tasks. Could be very helpful in the context of HCI or HRI. So those are the areas that I think are most interesting. I don't necessarily think this is the best way to build perceptive systems, but I also don't know that it's not.
Yep. And a related question, I mean, there's some research more from the ethology side on, let's say, navigation of other animals, mainly rodents, in mazes. Is there a way of relating that research with what you have been doing?
Yeah, actually, a lot of what I am interested in thinking about here in terms of simulation comes from rodent research. I mean, even things like Tolman's cognitive maps and vicarious trial and error, I think is really suggestive of some of the solutions that humans are probably using as well. So this research from kind of more recent evidence that supports the role of hippocampus place cells and potentially supporting these kind of hippocampal sweeps that occur in vicarious trial and error, where like a rat is at a fork in a maze and is looking down the left path and looking down the right path. These are what you might consider serialized simulation, right? Considering the downstream consequences of a current action. And I think this kind of evidence is one of the things that led us to ask these questions about parallel versus serial. So I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things that is very helpful from animal research and neuroscience is to be able to actually look inside and see what activation patterns are doing, and give us a little bit of guidance as to perhaps how humans are solving similar problems.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. Our next speaker is